seeker and advocate for the use of psychedelics in the field of mental health, unlike the rest of us. She is currently completing a book which chronicles her journey to healing as a participant in the MAPS-funded FDA trial to treat PTSD with MDMA. Lori has been interviewed by NPR, CBC, and ABC News, as well as the Gannett Weekly and psychedelia.support.com. She has spoken publicly at Tulane University, the New Orleans Psychedelic Society, and private events along with MAPS founder Rick Doblin. She has been featured on the podcasts Conscious Living Network, It's New Orleans, LA Talk Radio, and Psychedelics Today. Her work is published online at both PrimeMind.com, PrimeMind.com, and Medium.com. She is one of 3 subjects of the upcoming feature-length documentary about MDMA Psychotherapy by directors Kellerman and Micah Pellet. Lori currently serves as Executive Director of the Psychedelic Society of New Orleans, where she happily lives and co-parents her son with his 3 fathers. She can be reached through her website at lori-tipton.com. Please, a very, very, very warm welcome to our headliner, Lori Tipton!
That was a serious intro. Thank you guys so much for being here. It's really awesome to see so many people excited about this stuff, and I've heard so many amazing, inspiring talks today. So I really appreciate your time and energy being here. So thank you so much for that. So a little bit about me. I think he said everything. No, I'm from New Orleans, and I was the first person in New Orleans to participate in the MAPS-funded FDA trial to treat severe PTSD with MDMA. I was scrolling through social media one night, as I often do, and this was in the fall of 2017, and I saw a notice that they were looking for subjects in the New Orleans area. And immediately I sent an email, assuming that I probably wouldn't get chosen, because most of you guys know New Orleans has a lot of trauma. In fact, everybody I know there suffers from some level of PTSD. So I was hopeful, but I was not expecting to actually get into the study. I was very shocked when I did get a phone call very quickly, asking me a couple questions to see that if I could move on to the next kind of, it was very systemic for this to move through it since it was an FDA trial. A little bit about my trauma history. Like a lot of people, probably maybe some in this room, I grew up with a mentally ill parent. And when I was very small, my mother was mentally ill, and there were times when I would go to her and I would be able to get love and support. And there were other times I would go to her and I would get anger, or sometimes I would go to her and I would get nothing. And I think because of this, I developed a core of worthlessness. I was afraid of being abandoned. This might resonate with some of you. And I think perhaps if that is all that had happened to me and I had gotten good therapy, I would have turned out all right. Unfortunately, that's not how it turned out. When I was 20 years old, my brother was 22. He came to visit me in New Orleans, where I lived at the time, and he overdosed in my home. It was very tragic for me, obviously, because I was very close with my brother, and I had never suffered any loss like that before, and especially not with now, unfortunately, so many people are suffering from overdoses with opioids, but this was back in 1999 before there was the wave that there is today. When that happened, my mother really fell apart. I have a small child. I can't imagine what it would be like to lose him, so I can understand how that really forced the decline of my mother's mental health. And I didn't allow myself to really grieve the loss of my brother because I launched into taking care of my mother. I launched right into that role of caretaker, and I often did that in many subsequent traumas where I didn't allow myself to feel anything. I pretended like I was stronger, I locked it away, and just busied myself with whatever I needed to take care of. And in that case, it was taking care of my mother. Unfortunately, my mother finally succumbed to her mental illness, and in the July of 2005, just a month and a half shy of Hurricane Katrina, she murdered 2 women and herself. And she did this in her home, and I was the one to go to her house and discover that scene. As you can imagine, that was one of the worst days of my life. And had I been able to really understand that, or even begin the grieving process, perhaps things would have once again turned out differently. But a month and a half later, Hurricane Katrina destroyed the Gulf South. At that point, I felt like my trauma was just absorbed into everyone's collective trauma. There wasn't any room for me to feel my own grief on my own. And I also physically had to leave New Orleans. And so it was this whole idea of when you're trying to busy yourself and not think about your trauma, it's easy when you have to evacuate and change your entire life. I returned to New Orleans very quickly after the storm in 2005, and I threw myself into my work. I threw myself into my relationships with my friends. And a year later, in 2006, someone that I loved and trusted raped me. I subsequently became pregnant from that rape and had to have an abortion. So it was a lot of things to tell somebody on a phone interview very quickly as to why I had PTSD. I was like, well, are you ready for this story? So needless to say, she was like, well, I think you'll probably be a part of the study. So I went in and I began some psychometric testing. Now, leading up to this, even though, when I tell this story, it's almost bizarre to me because I understand that that's an incredible amount of trauma for a person to go through. But I still didn't understand that I had PTSD. I knew something was very wrong with me, but I never really inherently thought it was what PTSD was, because to me, the idea of PTSD was something that veterans had, and it was something that people had if they could not have basically a normal life, if they were unable to keep a job, if they killed themselves. These are the symptoms I thought were very common of PTSD. Also, the first time that I was officially diagnosed with PTSD was when I returned from Hurricane Katrina, and every person I know was diagnosed with PTSD. So if you live in a community where everyone has a disorder, is it really a disorder at that point? That was my question. And so it wasn't until I began the psychometric testing in order to get into the FDA trial that I understood just how much I had become less of myself, less of Lori Tipton, and more of a function of post-traumatic stress disorder. And what did that look like for me over the years? I had an extreme startle response. I was agitated all the time. I was so quick to anger all the time. In even relatively or completely safe situations, I would often feel terrified. I had horrible nightmares. I could never sleep a full night. I always went to fear and anxiety. I like to think of it like if we think of our brain as a smartphone and we're running all these apps. My brain ran the app of fear and anxiety all the time, so I couldn't force close it. So every part of my world, every bit of information that was coming in was filtered through fear and anxiety. And because of that, it made me really hard to connect with people on a serious level. I was exhausted all the time because I had this dualistic personality where I presented myself as like I have my shit together, but in reality, behind that, I had suicidal ideation all the time. I felt so tired. I felt so hopeless. And because I also felt alone, like who else can relate to me? Who understands what I'm going through? There was a separation. If I'm seeing the world this way, and why isn't anybody else afraid? Why isn't anybody else upset, right? It's because I didn't even realize how I was seeing the world. So it was when I started the psychometric testing, and there were a lot of questions that were asking like, what were you like beforehand? How do you react now? That I had a full-on existential crisis. Before even getting accepted formally into the study, I started questioning like, who am I? Who am I? And that was very, very frightening to me. So of course I did what every New Orleanian would do. I went to my therapist and said, what if I'm not myself when this is over with? And she looked at me, and then I went to my tarot card reader, and I was like, hey, what if I'm not myself when this is over with? And they both answered with the same thing, and they're not the same person. They both said, when this is over with, you're going to be more yourself. So, not to spoil it or anything, but we'll get there. So, I'm going to go sequentially through what it was like to participate in the MAPS trial, and hopefully I can give you a lot of information and answer your questions, but I will have lots of time at the end for questions. And even after I'm off the stage, if there's something I haven't addressed, please feel free to find me so I can answer all of your questions. So because this was an FDA trial, there was a lot of hoops to jump through. And after I was officially accepted into the trial, I began what was working with this co-therapy team. So for the MAPS protocol, there's 15 points of contact. Only 3 of those are medication sessions. So only 3 of the sessions are you given the drug MDMA. The rest of those are sessions before and after where you're prepping and you're integrating. And I can't stress enough how important it is to have these integrative sessions. And so I was working with a team, Sherry and Ray, male and female, and because I had a history of being in therapy, I really acclimated pretty easily to it. But I had a lot of skepticism because I recognized my privilege, and I've always had enough money to really seek out things, and I tried everything that you guys can think of, both Eastern and Western medicine, in the 10 years of suffering with my trauma. So I had been to psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, counselors. I had become a certified yoga teacher, gone on meditation retreats. I had tried Rolfing, physical therapy, done antidepressants, done anti-anxieties, went on ADHD medication. You name it, I've literally tried all of it. And none of it developed any sustaining, lasting effects for me in the positive direction. And in fact, most of those things often led to a lot of side effects and made me feel even worse. And I'm not here to talk badly about SSRIs or anti-anxiety medications. Whatever you need to get through the day is yours. They just did not work for me. I also think that they are like putting a Band-Aid on an arm that's been cut off. You're not getting to the core of the trauma. They're just fixing the symptoms. And a lot of times they're not really even fixing the symptoms. So going into this, I was rather skeptical because I had tried a lot of things beforehand and I had not found any lasting relief. I did decide, though, that I was going to try to be as open-hearted as possible because I felt extremely privileged to have the opportunity, especially in New Orleans, when there were so many people wanting to be a part of this study. So after we had our first few sessions where we just did traditional psychotherapy, so this would be more where we were getting, like we were sitting in a room, it would be 90 minutes to 2-hour sessions where we would kind of set and talk about goals for what we would be trying to achieve in the medicine sessions. This is also where I would be giving my trauma history and going through my background with them so that we were all on the same page going into this. On the days that I would be giving the medication, it would be a completely different experience, obviously. So on the days that I was given MDMA, I would show up there around 9 a.m. and I would be offered a first dose of MDMA. The first day I was offered a dose of 80 milligrams, and on every occasion I was always offered a supplemental dose within an hour of taking the first dose. And the supplemental dose was not intended to make me any higher, but was just intended to make the effects longer so that I could do more work, so to speak. One thing I want to really stress about this type of therapy is it's non-directive. So I, as the client, was leading it. There wasn't anybody there with a watch or an agenda trying to time me or tell me when we needed to talk about certain traumatic events, or really even to lead the discussion anywhere unless I was completely comfortable in doing so, which I think in itself is extremely radical compared to what we typically do in psychiatry and psychology in the United States. So once the medication would set in, on the first session, I remember that I felt really uneasy. I have had some experience with psychedelic drugs in the past before being in this study, but I had never done them in this type of setting, certainly not with two therapists literally like a few feet away from me while I was taking them. And the first session, really what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to gain trust with not just the therapy team, but with myself. Part of what happens for a lot of people who suffer from PTSD is it's hard for us to trust. There's a lot of stuff going on in our brains. PTSD affects your brains, like 3 areas specifically. Your amygdala, your ventromedial cortex, and your prefrontal cortex. And so one of the things that happens is with the amygdala is it goes into overdrive when you have PTSD. Therefore, you feel fear and anxiety much more often. You might be much like me and triggered and go into panic attacks much more often. You look at your world and you see it very differently than other people. Also, your hippocampus is what I like to call it hippocampus light. You lose some volume in your hippocampus. And right there, what happens is that's the storage house for your memories. So a lot of times what's going on with people with PTSD is you have a hard time discerning between what's happening currently in your life and what might have happened in the past. Therefore, you might get triggered in an environment where you don't actually understand where the trigger is coming from, but you physiologically have a response in your body that you can't necessarily quantify or make sense of in the moment. So what happens with MDMA is it helps to really calm the amygdala down, and it adds a lot of energy, or you can see it on a brain scan. There's a lot more like synapses firing in those other areas of your brain, in your hippocampus, in your ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so what was happening for me on the non-science side is I was recalling memories that weren't necessarily related to my trauma, but when I was recalling them, I was feeling them. And it's sometimes these things transcend words, and I'm sorry. It was almost as if one of the memories that I had was I remember playing in the snow with my brother, and I could remember exactly how that felt, like what that joy felt throughout my whole body. So it wasn't just a memory, and I hadn't thought of it in a really long time. Sorry, I get choked up.
No worries.
But when I thought it, it was like I felt it. And just understanding that I could do that again was incredible. Because for somebody who had locked their emotions away for so long, what happens is, for me, I locked away all this fear, or thought I did, and this anxiety and this anger, and I was trying to push it down, this sorrow and this trauma. But I also locked up this joy and this happiness. And so I was not feeling anything. There was such a separation between mind and body. And to be in that state, have these just memories start coming to me, no one directing them, nothing really, not looking through a photo album or anything, they're just showing up to me, and they're showing me what it's like to feel those things again. And it was incredible. I was in awe of it, and I was shocked. And at the end of the first session, it wasn't even that we had talked about any of my significant traumas at all, and I felt like, obviously something that happened, but also I felt a little worried. I was like, well, did anything happen? Because obviously, like, I'm not fixed. And so I likened it to dipping a towel in water, the corner of a towel. So, you dip the towel in water, eventually the water makes its way up the towel. And I kept telling myself that. I kept trying to be open and understanding that these changes were already taking place. And after the first session, so the sessions, for the days that I would go in and have a medication session, I would be with the team for 8 hours. And they would be there with me the whole time. I was invited to go inward. I was given an eye mask. I had a playlist from past psilocybin research available for me to listen to. It was a very comfortable room. It looked nothing like, a hospital room or anything like that. And I was invited to go in as much as I wanted to allow the medicine to work with me. A lot of what happens in this type of therapy, the way that the MAPS protocol is set up similar to what Stan Grof said about the inner healer. And so it's this idea that we all have the capacity within us to heal ourselves. Only we understand the traumas that we have suffered, and therefore we are the best at healing those traumas. And so what they were doing, Sherry and Ray, is they were creating for me a safe container to do the work that I needed to do for myself. So once again, this is such an empowering concept for psychotherapy. Normally, in the past, in a lot of my therapeutic settings, I would go somewhere expecting them to fix me, for them to give me a drug and the drug to fix me. And I was never told that I was going to fix me. I never believed that I could fix me. But yet, I went into the situation, and that is exactly what these two doctors were telling me. So, after the first session, a lot of people talk about having, taken MDMA and you come down the next day and you just feel like, shit, I have all this anxiety. That was not the case at all for me. I remember the next day I woke up and I went home, my partner picked me up, and we went out for pizza, and I was like, this is the most delicious pizza I have ever tasted in my life. And then, the next few days, I would be like, oh my God, do you hear that bird outside? There's a bird singing. And Andy, my partner, was like, it's incredible, because it's almost like you're an alien rediscovering the world for the first time. And what I realized it was like the gift of presence. I hadn't had that gift in so long. When you're constantly worried, when you're constantly projecting into the future, when you're hyper-vigilant, which I was the most hyper-vigilant of all the people I knew, you never are able to be present in the moment. And that's where, the most capacity for your joy lies, is in the present moment. And I was never able to be in the present moment. And so it was not that I didn't have these things, it was just that I could never actually feel them before. And that was really heartwarming to me and made me believe in continuing to go further in this therapy. When I went into the second session, I was given more of the drug. On the first session, I think that the total amount that I was given was 120 milligrams of MDMA. For the second and third sessions, I was given a total amount of 180 milligrams for both of those sessions. I always took the supplemental dose, because I'm from New Orleans and we always take the supplemental dose of anything that's given to us. But in the second session, I was given more of the drug, and so I was able to get into a more relaxed state quicker. I had, like I said before, I had become a certified yoga teacher. I traveled and did meditation retreats. I tried to meditate all the time. I had Headspace on my iPhone. I could never meditate. I could never find that space. And when I was in that second session with MDMA, I experienced what it was like to be able to witness my thoughts and feelings and not be attached to them. Which was, I know for some people who meditate, that might not sound like a big deal, but for me, it was one of the biggest accomplishments I've had in my life, was to actually see that I could be unattached to these things, to realize that within all of us there is a pool of all of these emotions that we can move through and not be attached to. And to feel that and to have that inherent knowledge coming from myself was a gift that was just such a blessing that will never go away from me. It's one thing if I'm sitting in my therapist's office and she's explaining to me, you have PTSD and this is what's going on and this is the reaction of it. That's fine. I'm not necessarily hearing it. But if I'm in this session and the knowledge is coming from within me. It is a part of me, so it is therefore the truth. So it changed me significantly. And I remember feeling like I had, all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I've been viewing my world through dirty glasses for years, and all of a sudden somebody has cleaned them. And I just really fell apart in my second session because I realized just how beautiful my life was. Like how charmed I am and the amount of love that I have surrounded myself with. And it broke my heart, and I had so much empathy for myself at the same time because I realized that I had always had this around me, but I just could not feel it. And it was just incredibly empowering for me to know that. And I looked at myself. I have, my partner and I couldn't have children together, so we chose another couple. So my son has 3 fathers. And I remember just sitting there and just crying because I realized just how fortunate and how much love I had around me that I just couldn't feel for so long. And that was incredible. I felt like the second session was really this true reconnection of brain and body. And so, like a lot of things, when I came out of it, instead of it being so joyous and wonderful after the second session, it was very, very sad because I felt like in that connection back to myself, there was a lot of unresolved sadness that I had never dealt with. And it came, and it didn't leave for several days. And there were several days I spent sitting in my recliner, crying and allowing myself to feel these feelings. And for the first time in my life, not feeling like I wanted to kill myself. And understanding that they were feelings and that they would pass. And that was something that I had never been able to understand before. In the past, if I had those feelings, I would either try to kill myself, or I would go to some very poor distraction technique, drinking too much, using drugs, fucking somebody, like these things to not feel that pain. But to sit with that pain and allow myself to feel it was revolutionary for me. And I really am proud of myself for doing that and also for staying with the study. Thank you. Thank you very much. So moving into the third session was where we really did a lot of the intense work of healing with MDMA. I had spoken to both Sherry and Ray at length beforehand about some of the things that were happening to me physically, some of the manifestations of this disorder that were really upsetting and abrupting my life all the time, and how we might work with those things and utilize this time with this medicine in order to dive deep, to get to know myself and to allow myself to do some real healing. And I really liken Sherry and Ray to like my spiritual doulas, because they were there truly creating a safe space for me to do the work that I needed to do. I felt like that movie Poltergeist, where like, you know, the mother has to go in and get Carol Ann and they tie that rope to her and like, they're like, oh, we'll pull you out if we need to. Like, that's how I felt about Sherry and Ray. I was like, oh, if it gets too bad, they'll pull me out. But it never got that bad, thankfully. We went into the third session and we decided that we were going to talk about my mother's death. And one of the things that had happened with my mother's death is there were parts of that situation that I could not remember. So I had amazing memory of some parts of it, but then it just felt like somebody had taken like a VHS tape and like cut out clips of it, and they were just completely gone. I could not bring them into my memory no matter how hard I tried. And so in the therapy room, very high on MDMA, I decided to put myself back into that situation and walk back into that house in my memory and see what I could discover. And it was very, it was just heartbreaking for me to go back into that memory, but it was so cathartic. Because for one, everything that I could not remember was there. And it wasn't a fabrication of my imagination. It was inherent knowledge within me that had been in me that I was finally able to grasp again. Secondly, there was just such an outpouring of empathy for the entire situation. For my mother, understanding just how far and just where she was in her life, the amount of empathy I felt for her then, but more so the empathy I felt for myself. Because I had lived for so long with shame and the burden of guilt over what had happened. And in those moments, in being there, more physically present in that room on MDMA than I was on the day that I actually walked in my house, I was able to find forgiveness in a way that I didn't ever think was going to be possible for me. And that was just completely incredible. Moving forward, after we did that, which was just, you know, the small thing we did, most people would be like, okay, that's good, we're gonna leave for the day. But there was still some more work to do. For me, I had suffered several traumas, obviously, but the one that was always the hardest for me was my sexual assault. It was something I never talked about, and it was something that continued to affect me all the time. There were several instances in my life where I would be with my partner and we would be about to, have sex or make love, whatever you want to call it. And something would happen for me. I would be triggered, and I can't even say exactly what it was, but all of a sudden I would have that full visceral reaction that something horrible was going to happen, like there was a tiger in the room. And I couldn't predict it. And just that in itself, not knowing when it would happen, was really difficult for me because I didn't want to always engage in sexual activity because then I had the fear that I would have this reaction. And so that was something that that continued to happen for me for over a decade. And I had explained to them before going into, when we were doing all these sessions beforehand, I had explained to them that as a yoga teacher, there were certain times, thank you, there were, here we go, much better. Thank you. That as a yoga teacher, there were certain poses that I would completely avoid teaching because if I put myself in those poses physically, I would go straight into a panic. I would have a visceral reaction very similar to the ones that I would have sometimes with initiating sex. And those positions were like plow and shoulder stand. Anywhere where I felt like I was confined, where I was being pushed down, where I was being held down, I could not do those poses. So as I was sitting in the treatment room, I started to talk about my rape, and I told the story, and as I told the story, I felt very powerless and dejected, and I didn't feel any catharsis over it. In fact, I felt worse after telling the story than before. And one of the doctors, I'm not sure exactly which one, it gets a little hazy in there, said, this is what we're seeing we see that you feel this way, is this, basically modeling what I was telling you back to them. And they said, would you be comfortable perhaps trying to put yourself in one of these physical poses? How would you feel about that? And I'm like, okay, why not? I'm here. We'll do this. I already feel horrible, so we'll try this. But then I did like the very typical child reaction where I was like, oh, I need to wash my hands and I should eat a mint and then drink some water. It was like even very high on MDMA, I tried to distract myself and not do the work that I needed to do. But finally I was like, okay, I'm going to go over to the mat and I'm going to do this. And so I like to say the caveat of like, being someone who practices yoga regularly, there was no physical danger of me putting myself in these poses. There was just the emotional danger of what might come up. So I went over to the mat and I was like, okay, I'm going to go into plow pose. And the minute I went into plow pose, it was just like, somebody flipped the switch and there I was. And I was terrified and I couldn't breathe and I was overwhelmed and I was in a full panic. And both the doctors were next to me. One was holding my hand. And Sherry asked me, she said, what are you feeling? And I said, well, I feel trapped. I feel terrified. I feel ashamed. And she said, well, what does that feeling need? And before I could come up with the answer, I just said, it needs to be heard. I need to be heard. And that was it. Like for me, I just felt like here I was, very high on MDMA. And I just wanted someone to hear my story and to believe me because at the time I didn't have that. And they said, well, we hear you and we believe you. And it was almost like, it was a catharsis that is hard to put into words, with someone just holding my hand and saying those simple words to me in that moment. I felt something release in myself that I never could have imagined. And I came out of the pose and I took some really beautiful free breaths. And then I went back into the pose 2 more times. And as I went back into that pose, it was uncomfortable, but it lessened each time. And that 3rd time when I went into the pose, I had felt none of the shame that I had felt before and none of the fear, which is incredible. And since that, I finished the trial in March of 2018, I have not had any kind of sexual dysfunction since I've done the trial at all. So that's amazing. So a lot of times people will ask me, they'll say, well, are you healed now? And I always am like, well, what does healed mean, right? Sometimes healed means sitting in your recliner and crying for 6 days in a row because you're finally feeling the sorrow of all the things you went through. Sometimes healed means that you are still triggered. Sometimes healed means that you have to cry because you realize that you missed out on the first 4 years of your son's life because you were physically there, but you weren't emotionally available. But sometimes healed looks like really beautiful things. And those beautiful things I can quantify on those little sheets, and I can tell you guys that I sleep better than I've ever slept. And my star response is really, really low. And I'm less quick to get angry. And I generally have much less anxiety than I ever expected. But for me, what it really looks like is the relationships that I have with the people I love are so much closer than I ever thought they could be. That I have this gift of presence, that I can show up and I can 100% be there for somebody without my brain being in 100 other different places worrying about what's happening. Before I went into the trial, I was always like the authoritarian parent. You know, there's 4 of us, so there's already some competition out there. But I was always the one that was making all the rules and enforcing them. And, you know, the most amazing moment of my life was a couple months after I had finished the study. I was playing with my son one day, and he looked at me, he goes, "You're so silly. You're so much fun. You're the funnest now." And for me, that was like the best feeling in the whole world, because here's somebody that I could never trick. No matter how hard I tried, I could never trick my child. And for him to see that change in me has been the most miraculous thing. I'm very, very, very devoted to talking about this subject, because I think the more that we talk about it, the more we tell our stories, the more we personalize this data so people know that this is happening and that it can help people, the quicker it will become descheduled. I think about all the people who suffer from PTSD, especially in New Orleans that I know. New Orleans is not like Portland, it's not like San Francisco. We are basically in the dark ages of psychedelics. I, along with a few other people, are the executive directors of the Psychedelic Society of New Orleans, and I often travel and I'm just like blown away at how awesome other cities, they're you know, they just have so many more options than we have right now. In the South, you know, you can't use cannabis at all legally, and there are still people being incarcerated every day for cannabis in the South. There are no ketamine clinics. There are, you know, people don't even understand what MDMA is. And so for me, it's a really, I don't want people to be left behind at all, especially the people I love so dearly from the city that I'm from. I also think it's just completely a travesty that in the United States, 22 veterans a day kill themselves. That is the current statistic. And so for me, not only is it heartbreaking, but it's a disservice to humankind that we aren't offering these things to people when I know the capacity that they have for healing. I won't say that MDMA therapy will work for everyone with PTSD, but I will say that I feel it could not hurt anyone with PTSD. And I know from what I've learned, from what I've read, from the research I've done, the biggest, you know, medical concern is for people who have any kind of heart disease, because there is a methamphetamine component to the drug, but even that can be usually taken care of with a beta blocker. So for me, looking forward, I'm hoping that we can have more discussions about this. I'm hoping that people understand that this is a legitimate therapy. This is not something on the fringes. This is not something strange. This is something that can save lives. The fact that I'm up here today talking to you all and I haven't killed myself proves to me that this should not be a Schedule I drug. So at this point, I work a lot on I'm writing a book about my experience. I try to talk as often as possible. If anybody needs to reach out, my website is lori-tipton.com. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to take those now.
Just real quick, did you say Sherry and Ray were your doulas?
I consider them my spiritual doulas. They were
I have no idea what a doula is.
Oh, so a doula is somebody that helps with childbirth. So it's like similar to a midwife, but they're literally there just to support the woman in giving birth. That's it. Okay. They're not necessarily, they're a medical professional, but they're there literally to just support the mother in whatever she needs. Yeah. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Do you still use MDMA on your own terms?
I have. I use most of these drugs now in a very healing capacity. In my youth, I used a lot of them a lot more recreationally, and I don't have anything against recreation, but I have, since I've been out of the study, I've only used it once, and I didn't use it even in a sense of feeling that I needed it. It was imperative to me because I felt like I truly got so much out of the study. But I live in New Orleans and we celebrate a lot for Mardi Gras, and I had an opportunity to use it. So I wasn't going to turn it down. Any other questions? Yes.
Not really a question. I want to thank you for being so open and present and vulnerable and talking about the hard shit.
Thank you.
This like my presentation earlier on bulimia, this stuff thrives in the closet where we're not understood And it's only when you're on the other side that you can effectively express it to the people that need to hear it. So God bless you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yes.
So the Mardi Gras celebration, how did that settle into you differently than obviously in the protected therapeutic setting? Were you able to relax into sort of being home? It is for me.
Yes, absolutely. I think that for me, one of the things that I have learned and really stressed out to other people is just like safe drug use. So making sure you're in a good setting so you don't flip out. And for me, definitely, like a lot of the reconnection with my body has been spectacular. And so using that medicine afterwards, that drug afterwards, and not having those levels of fear and anxiety that I just had before regularly present in my life, I was truly able to thoroughly enjoy it in a way that I don't think I would have been able to before.
Kind of like a graduation present.
Absolutely. Definitely. Any other questions?
Do you feel there's actually a potential for healing in a recreational setting? And what I mean by that is I know somebody who puts together what are called love parties to do essentially heal everybody that shows up. It's not a therapeutic session. It's a friend session. What would you like? I guess what I'm trying to ask, and I'm not asking very well, is what is the difference between a therapist healing session and getting together with people you know and love for a healing session? Like,
Well, I think the thing with the one of the main differences is, so in the therapist healing session, I'm obviously kind of a star of that show because I'm the only one on MDMA, and we're really trying to unpack and allow some of this trauma to come to the surface. And while I do think these medicines are incredible for recreational use, and especially in a safe environment where other people are doing it, I don't know if everybody were on the drug, if something so deep as like some significant rape trauma were to come up, if everyone would be prepared to handle that if they were also on medicine. And so that's it. Like, you can't really predict how you're going to react to something when you're altered.
thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Are there clinics for MDMA use for your clients who seek trauma currently?
The way that you can get involved with the studies is there's a website called clinicaltrials.gov. And if you get on that website, you can search for MDMA and it will bring up all the testing sites in the United States that are currently doing research. There is one here in Portland, Oregon that I believe is recruiting people for the phase 3 trial currently.
It's called the Somatic Institute.
The Somatic Institute, yes. And I've met a couple of the practitioners there, and they're very incredible people. Yes?
One last question. How would you compare the actual physical effects and feel of clinical purity MDMA as opposed to street level MDMA? That's one of the most commonly asked questions I get from people trying to get in.
Well, luckily, like the MDMA, sorry I can't see you, Hawkeye.
That's all right.
Luckily, the MDMA that I took that was street level, I tested it, which I highly suggest that everybody test their drugs.
Absolutely.
And so it was MDMA and there wasn't the presence of methamphetamine or anything in it. So it truthfully, like, it was during a magical time. So it was a very different situation. But I would say that I didn't notice a stark change in the quality. But also, it was very fantastical to be using MDMA in therapy and dealing with the trauma. So I think just the set and setting alone, like, the purity didn't necessarily factor into that, if that makes sense.
Okay, because I was just curious because a lot of the MDMA studies are noting that people who go through the trials are not having the same kind of drop effect and things that you get from street level MDMA, which I've seen anywhere in the 85 to high 90 range, 97 on the street. That's really it's really rare to get there. But usually like the mid 80s, mid to high 80s is on the street level, where the clinical is 99. And so there's some data to say that there's less drop, less depression after.
I think, and I also just think that truly a lot of it is situational, because I've had a lot of friends be like, every time I take MDMA, I feel like shit the next day. I'm like, I also saw you drinking like 7 High Lifes in the bar at 7 a.m. And so I'm not going to blame the MDMA for the fact that you feel, and also the idea that a lot of times, so one of the things, Tom, that you said, and one of the things my husband says that I think is so beautiful, is that like recreation can be healing, because there are some people who don't have the opportunity to feel good in their normal lives. And so when they get a chance to feel good and like take a drug and have that recreation experience, it's healing for them. And I think that for some people, when you do have that true recreation fun, and then you have to go back to work the next day or things like that, there's naturally some changing. And of course, this does affect the serotonin system, so there is that fluctuation that we can't say doesn't exist. But for me personally, I didn't have any of the like ecstasy hangover, as a lot of people would call it. I did not experience that. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, back there with the band.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
One is well, they're both serious, I guess. But the first question is, I'm from Florida, and I like eating alligators. Marshmallows, and I hear from New Orleans. Do they do that in New Orleans?
Yes, we do. Like to make them really nice for the boat tours. We absolutely feed alligators marshmallows. I was an alligator for Mardi Gras this year, so.
Once in a life, put a smile on the giant beast. Anyways, the second one is I also have this problem of not understanding feelings. I feel like I can intellectualize feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and I would sit there and be like, I said things like, I'll start thinking about math and frequency and like frequencies and vibration, and I don't experience the feeling at all, right? And how did you learn to trust the sort of the process of breathing or feeling through things and not having to
Because of the drug, truly. Like that is, I often say one of the things that I will credit is I really want to talk about the integration sessions afterwards, and I really didn't go into that as much as I should have, even if the respect it deserves. Like what happened in the medication sessions is amazing, and when in those medication sessions, that veil was completely lifted. So I was just forced to feel these things, which was beautiful, because a lot of what I was feeling, it was just returning to feeling after not feeling anything, even when it's kind of uneasy feelings, is still beautiful. And it was afterwards in these integrative sessions that we would have, several of, where I was able to talk about that. And I was able to then recall other instances where I felt triggered. And I was reminded, almost like through somatic therapy in some ways, to be like, well, can you ask what your body was feeling then? So it was after, when I was no longer on MDMA, it was a bit of retraining my mind to stay with my body. And there were several times, and I'll be honest, I'm a work in progress. There are times when I get triggered and I don't stay in my body, and I'll know it because one of my reactions is to get really quick-witted and very mean. And if I find myself doing that, righteous indignation, I know I'm no longer in my body and I have to check back. Did that answer your question? Okay. No problem. Was there some other questions? Yes. Oh, give me one. Oh, sorry. Okay. Go ahead, ma'am. Sure.
So you had your last session, and then how many integration sessions did you have after each session?
3. So it's 15 points of contact. So there is 3 sessions in between. So it would be 3 sessions in the first medication, 3 sessions in the second medication, 3 sessions in the third, and then actually a final 3 after the third medicine session.
And then after those 3 sessions, so you said that sometimes you still will get triggered. What did you do for treatment and integration after that, and how did MAPS assist you with furthering your integration of the treatment?
Sure. Well, one of the really great things about me is I was in therapy throughout the whole thing with my regular therapist, who was extremely supportive of the work I was doing within the clinical trial. And she remarked that what I had done in about, a 5-month period is what most people do in about 20 to 30 years of hard regular therapy. So she was there actually coinciding to help me and has really allowed me to continue with the integrative process. When I finished the trial, I was able to, at this point, I was given contact information for both of the therapists that I was in therapy with. I've never necessarily needed to use it. Another thing I did is I helped to form the Psychedelic Society of New Orleans so that I could help with other people and talk to people, and we offer integrative circles and things like that, because I do think that part of this needs to be grassroots, and a lot of times, like, as much as I love that study, the amount of hours that those therapists put in just for me, in order for them to be able to do that for other people, I'd like to see more community-based areas where people can help each other in a safe environment. So, did that answer it for you?
Yes.
Awesome. Other questions? Is that it? Yeah? I think so. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you all for being here. We're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and then we're going to get into the psychedelic storytelling. So hope to see some of you back. If not, we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for being here for the first day of the Guy and Mind Psychedelic Conference.